And I wish I had good news on that, Yang. Unfortunately, what I hear most day in and day out from parents and even teachers sometimes are frustrated. They know that they need to be getting something done, but there's kind of a bureaucratic process going on.
Do you have or teach a child with dyslexia? If so, this episode will be crucial in your understanding about how best to support this child's development. Stick around during this episode and learn from a renowned world expert on this topic. Hey everyone, welcome to the Child Care Channel and the Child Care Channel podcast. Our intention is for this to be a space where we come together to elevate the childcare industry through community, inspiration, and innovation that will ultimately serve the healthy development of children. My name is Jane Diaz, and I am your host. Today we have with us Georgie Norman. Georgie is a passionate advocate for early dyslexia screening and intervention. As the founder of Early Literacy Solutions, she has dedicated her career to supporting students with dyslexia and ensuring their reading success. Georgie is the author of the Fluency Builders Dyslexia program and has developed innovative screeners to identify children at risk of reading failure. With her deep knowledge in reading education and expertise in Orton Gillingham's methodology, Georgie combines the latest neuroscience research with proven strategies to empower children with dyslexia. Get ready to be inspired by her insights and practical tools for supporting young readers. Georgie, it's such a pleasure to have you here today. How are you doing?
Thank you, Yang. I'm fine, and I appreciate the opportunity of being here with you.
Of course. This is such an important topic. I mean, I have friends, adult friends, who have shared with me their struggles growing up with dyslexia. I even know a 6-year-old who's quite smart, who has actually, been able to overcome and learn to work with this type of, let's say, way of thinking. I don't like to use disability, and maybe you can shine some light on
Right.
it. I don't like to use disability because at the end of the day, we all think differently. But
That's right.
I wanted to hear from you as the expert on this topic. First of all, what is dyslexia? What
We
how does it come about, and why do we need to pay attention to this?
Well, you made a good point there, Yang, about it has nothing to do with IQ. There are many, all of the children with dyslexia are as intelligent as their classmates. It isn't related to IQ at all, which makes it so frustrating because many times they have more self-awareness about being behind in school. And they pick this up very early and can even develop depression, anxiety because we all compare ourselves to each other. We don't want to do that, but it just happens. And dyslexia is neurobiological. And probably the easiest way to describe it is that it represents inefficiencies in the reading circuit within the brain. So that affects the whole process of reading, fluency. It also affects just how they learn in terms of phonemic awareness, their sensitivity to understanding individual sounds, make words. And so these inefficiencies in the reading circuit of the brain affect every part of reading. So they do have to learn differently when they're learning to read. But again, it's not an intelligence issue at all. So I was glad that you brought that out.
Amazing. No, absolutely. And tell us a little bit about, because, here at the Child Care Channel, we want to learn especially what happens with the demographics of ages 0 through 5 in children.
Mhm.
And we have a lot of people who are somewhat directly serving that demographic of children. And so I know that dyslexia doesn't just start in your adulthood, it starts since the very beginning. So can you tell us a little bit about how to identify, what are some risk factors involved?
Okay. And of course it can be identified before reading starts, but I mean, no one is advocating doing MRI studies, which actually do show these differences in the brain. But anybody that would work, parents and anyone that works with young children, the two most important risk factors for dyslexia is because it has a genetic link to it. Any family history of reading difficulties, whether a family member was ever officially diagnosed with dyslexia or not, if there's that history, especially with either parent, both parents, or even, sometimes a grandparent may have a speech disorder. And that's kind of a little sign that the components of dyslexia may be present in the family. And also if the child has an early language delay, those are kind of the two red flags that you would pick up between 0 and 5, that there could be a problem and that this needs to be watched very carefully and screened very early. For example, we advocate that the laws right now are changing so that screening would take place in kindergarten. We're advocating to move that a year earlier because there is already an achievement gap in reading by the first grade if there is no intervention in place. So you're really impacting that child's academic trajectory if you don't pick up on those two signals. And as a parent, push to have that child tested as soon as they are beginning reading instruction in kindergarten.
Okay, so that's let me recap that what you just said. So two early risk factors that could be useful for identifying whether a child is going to have dyslexia or not. And so that would be the family history of reading difficulties, if anybody has a history of that. And then early language delay. Actually, the example that I referenced at the beginning of our interview of the adult and the child is actually mother and daughter. So the mother did have dyslexia growing up, the daughter also has it. And so it's
Right.
interesting. It's interesting, the genetic component to it. But let me ask you something, so I know that it's when children are not of school age yet, it might be a little bit more challenging to identify whether something is dyslexia or something else, right? And
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. I have a friend who actually graduated valedictorian of his class in high school, but he actually didn't speak until he was about 5,
Oh,
right?
that's interesting.
Right. And so, I'm just wondering if there are any other considerations, right, for the demographic of ages 0 through 5 that
Mhm.
could be indicators that, this might be actually something that leads to reading difficulty.
Well, there are some other signs that show up during that period of time. For example, following multi-step instructions. Sometimes there's some coordination issues. It's not always real prevalent, but there are little signs like that. And if you think about it from a statistical aspect, up to 20% of students do have some features of dyslexia. They may not have the entire spectrum of all of the reading difficulties that a student can have, and there's multiple deficit profiles within dyslexia. It's not a one size fits all thing. But in those early years, those might be other things that you pick up. And that's interesting about the example that you're giving. So many, because we haven't ramped up dyslexia screening until just recently, and it's still a very slow process. So many students made it through high school with great difficulty having to overcome this on their own. And, you developing their strong skill sets and everything to overcome and to make it. And so diagnosis has not been a real common thing in the past.
I'm wondering now that you say that, because obviously when they enter school is when symptoms, let's say, become more obvious, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So that considered, what are some experiences that the people you've worked with have had that have allowed them to do something about this and really help the child in this case more effectively?
And I wish I had good news on that, Yang. Unfortunately, what I hear most day in and day out from parents and even teachers sometimes are frustrated. And they know that they need to be getting something done, but there's kind of a bureaucratic process going on. It's getting better. I feel like the schools that I work with, they are trying so hard to ramp this up. But in general, there's often, we call it the wait to fail model. And it's because information isn't still out there like it needs to be. That's changing, but it is. And the wait to fail model is where the school may even recommend that, say, a child be retained in the first grade. So basically, there's kind of an ongoing battle on where parents almost have to be the child's advocate and push for testing. As soon as let's just take pre-K, for example. As soon as a teacher mentions that the student isn't learning the letters and sounds, that's a huge red flag early in the process because a lot of times that starts in the very beginning of pre-K. As soon as this, as soon as the student gets or the parent gets any kind of report that that child is behind in any of the literacy activities, That's a huge red flag. But what happens a lot of times is they're told, and it's a well-meaning teacher that would say this is, I think they're going to catch up. Let's wait. Let's wait. And then by the time they hit first grade, many times the recommendation is that they be retained, which does retention is not an intervention. In fact, usually nothing changes when a child is retained in the first grade because they're getting the same reading instruction that failed them before, and because they have to have a different approach to reading instruction if they're going to succeed. So these are kind of the things that come up is that maybe the parents are not necessarily aware that it is a big deal if they're having trouble learning their letters and sounds. If they're behind at all in any literacy activities in pre-K or kindergarten, it needs to be addressed immediately. And a lot of times it's not. As I said, I think the schools are becoming much more aware. Screening is getting into more schools, but really, I think at this point, we're still at the point where parents have to be watchful, especially if those two risk factors exist.
Okay, that's actually an excellent point. And if you're a parent and you're listening to this and you might worry that your child might have dyslexia or they're experiencing some level of delay in learning, reading, or something related to that, then pay attention to what are the behaviors. And so, Georgie, who can they reach out to if this is something that they notice as a pattern of concern?
Well, the school, first of all, because they have a system called MTSS that is in place. It's not always easy. So there are three tiers of instruction in this MTSS framework. There's the core instruction that all the students leave or all the students take, and then there is tier two, which is students that need extra help, and then tier three. But what happens is if sometimes if they talk to the teacher will put them in a small group intervention. But for a dyslexic student, and there are ranges of dyslexia, in my opinion, all of them should immediately go to tier three, which is an intensive daily intervention. That way, you're going to stop it in its tracks. You're going to prevent reading failure as early as pre-K, or in the case of kindergarten, that first few weeks of kindergarten, this should take place. And it's not hard for the other things that teachers may notice is they have difficulty learning to write. Their letters may float above the lines and they can't quite get those letters made, or it's a very slow, painful process. So there's any kind of literacy activity like handwriting or learning the letters and their sounds. That's already a huge red flag. So parents should start with the school. But unfortunately, I've heard many cases where parents have to go to get an outside evaluation, a neuropsych to do a complete evaluation. And sometimes that will push the school into maybe an IEP for that student, getting them an individualized educational plan to make sure that they're getting the level of intervention that they need. Unfortunately, that's still true. I talk to many parents that for whatever reason, it's that wait to fail model. And so they go out and they get their own independent and bring it to the school. It shouldn't be that way, but we're kind of in a transition period, I guess you'd say.
Absolutely. And as you were saying, this is not something that's knowledge that was mainstream before.
Right.
So question for you, when you're talking about intervention, right? The child that is working on, with someone on this intervention,
Right.
what are some of the things that they actually work on with the child? Because if dyslexia has a neurological component, this is the way the brain is wired, right? At least this is my understanding. You correct me if I'm wrong. This is the
Right.
way the brain is wired. So how they learn must be different than how somebody who doesn't have that learns, right? So can you just share, just for people that like me who don't know, what does this intervention look like?
Well, this is the good news, Yane, is that we know from pre and post MRI studies that intervention actually rewires the brain. It's so exciting and it gives so much hope. So you mentioned early on about the Orton Gillingham methodology. This is a real explicit, sequential, systematic approach, which in the classroom sometimes it, it can be it may be not as systematic as it needs to be for these students to pick up, but also they need a tremendous amount of repetition. So they can't handle the pace that's done in the classroom where they're learning these phonological skills and they move on to the next phonics component and they move on to the next. They can't do that. They need time for a lot of repetition at each level of this systematic instruction. And only if they get that time to, for example, they may see a word 100 times and they won't recognize it. Where your average student, when they've had phonics instruction and reading instruction, after a while, they're not having to break apart and to decode those words, each individual sound. They've seen the word 100 times and they just say it from memory. Well, one of the impairments in dyslexia is in a region of the brain called the visual word form area, and that's impaired. And that's where that automaticity that a lot of students will have after encountering a word a few times, that isn't there for the dyslexic student. So it takes a lot more work to correct the inefficiency and impairment that's in that visual word form area. So a dyslexia intervention, there'll be an awful lot of repetition. The other element that helps dyslexic students to rewire the brain is not just that phonological side, but also they need much more fluency training. And fluency is included in most reading instruction programs, but for a dyslexic child, they have to have a concentrated period of working with these new phonological skills and reading them faster. And also handwriting is much more important. It's important for all children because they know that handwriting rewires the brain by itself. But for a dyslexic child, they need to become fluent in handwriting, even more fluent than the average student. So fluency exercises that involve repeated timed handwriting and repeated timed reading of word lists and decodable sentences as they first start. And decodable simply means these sentences are based on instruction that child has actually had. Because if they don't get that, dyslexic students start out just guessing words. They may take the first letter and say, and they'll just create a word. Sometimes it won't even be a real word. But so dyslexic students need an entirely different level of intensity and repetition that an average student would need. So that's how it would look different. They can't just move along, a scope and sequence like other students. They've got to stop, develop automaticity with what they've learned, and then go on to new skills. So that's why a typical classroom core instruction is so hard for them to keep up, and they get behind very fast. As I said, first grade, they're way, way behind by the time they get to first grade if they haven't received that early intervention.
Mm. Are there any particular age groups where the number is greater of students with dyslexia?
I think it's just across the general population. It can be up to 20%. You'll see different percentages, but I think in other words, a lot of older students were never identified. They just pass. Sometimes without the screening in place, a lot of times they'll think it's a general learning disability and not realize that it's a reading disability. But you'll see that they're intelligent. Many older students who weren't identified and maybe never got an intervention, which intervention can still be effective in these older years, but they'll use audiobooks, they'll use YouTube and other things to balance any content that they're missing at school because of the reading disability.
Wow. Okay. And you said 20% tends to be the average, just about any age group with
Right. And that's
potentially dyslexia.
worldwide. Right. That's worldwide.
Wow.
Now, intervention can change that, of course. And I won't use the word cure, but as I said, we already know we've seen it on MRI studies that the brain does change with intervention. So it's something that can be, I'll use the word remediated rather than cure, but the brain is amazing and they already have a reduced capacity for the brain to change. But if that intervention is real intense, you'll see that they can definitely the brain is rewired.
That's amazing. And, it's interesting because I think in not everywhere in the world, but in a lot of countries in the world, the education system pretty much treats everybody the same. And now what I'm hearing from you is that potentially 1 in 5 children actually
Right.
have a different way to learn, right?
Exactly.
And so, like that, you also have children with ADHD, which is a very common diagnosis, in my opinion, way too much of a diagnosis nowadays. And that's
Right.
just children who also learn differently, you know? And so, what's incredible to me is that we are in this educational system, whether it's in the early childhood education or beyond, where we're treating every child for the most part the same, right?
Right.
So, in
Right.
thinking about this, what if we were to reimagine the way that this whole system works, starting with the early childhood years, from your viewpoint of an expert in this particular area of dyslexia? Can you think of some ideas of how we could reimagine the way that we do education?
Well, it definitely has to be more individualized, and even within dyslexia itself, it's not a one size fits all reading disability. There are many different profiles because it is neurological, and a comprehensive screener breaks it down, and then the recommendations that result from the screening help you tailor that intervention to their particular deficit. And when you mentioned ADHD, there's a very high percentage of co-occurrence of ADHD with dyslexia. And that, of course, complicates, especially for a younger children that hasn't learned, it really hasn't been trained in self-regulation. That makes reading instruction very hard for them and for the teacher slash tutor because it takes focus. Learning to read takes a tremendous amount of focus. So that co-occurring morbidity with ADHD complicates the ability to learn to read. So it's if that is picked up in early childhood, in that 0 to 5 range, I am not a real advocate of medication, but I think to when you consider the cost of losing a good academic trajectory, there are cases where, at least temporarily, for the sake of reading instruction, that it may need to be addressed with medication. But I know there's natural ways to address ADHD. And in those early years, if a parent or say the pediatrician notices that, that should be addressed as early as possible because that will definitely, along with the dyslexia, interfere with their ability to take in the reading instruction that they're getting.
Hmm. Okay. And Georgie, I'm curious now. I want to shift the focus a little bit more to you and your own trajectory. What made you even get into this field of dyslexia?
Well, I've always had an interest in literacy, and I've worked with students, dyslexic students, for years, and just loved it. And can empathize with the terrible struggle they've had. Some of them were retained in the embarrassment and humiliation, and so working with, and I've used many different programs, and I always felt that it shouldn't take years to remediate this. And that led me to research on why is it taking so many years to remediate this. And that led me to research on fluency because as it turns out, some of the research has come out in the last 5 years. If in the intervention, there's several components to intervention to teach your children to read. If you focus more heavily on fluency training from the very beginning, it produces a shortcut into those gains, the reading gains. So it shouldn't have to take years. We did a pilot recently that where the students in the pilot who had dyslexia were able to make tremendous gains in 6 weeks. But we used that research on fluency, and that it made a huge difference. In other words, their gains just weren't in their rate of reading, that component of fluency. Their gains were in every reading measure, even comprehension. So I think this research has not gotten enough attention yet. And this really excited me when I saw this because I felt that the Gillingham methodology has been out for over 100 years. And at that time, we only knew that there was a phonological deficit. We didn't know that there was something called a RAND deficit, which shows the efficiency of the whole reading circuit. We didn't really know about that until more recently, but then there still weren't studies done on how fluency can impact that learning curve and speed it up. And so it was just exciting research to me.
That is exciting research. Okay, so that's how you got into this whole thing. What were you working on before this came into your awareness back then?
Well, just doing dyslexia intervention kind of the way it's always been done, and just seeing how long it took because they weren't getting that intensity with that. And they would sometimes fall back. They would regress a little bit, and when I looked at that research, I thought this is that missing ingredient.
Hmm.
Fluency is in almost every dyslexia intervention, but not at the level that it needs to be. What this research showed is that the intensity of the fluency training can shorten the entire intervention and help them make progress faster.
Hmm. Yeah, I was asking because, obviously, so you started the work in dyslexia, but I wanted to get to the bottom of why did you even choose that as a career path or as a work? You were a child at some point and then you
Mhm.
decided to study something. So was there a
Mhm.
driving force? Was there a personal example of somebody in your life or maybe yourself with dyslexia that
Well,
prompted you?
I think just this, I've always had that love for literacy, and teaching children to read was just something that I loved to do when I started doing that. So it really just, there's just something so rewarding about seeing a child make this leap. Even children without dyslexia, teaching them to read is just a wonderful thing. So I think it was just, I chose it because I knew I'd love to teach children to read. But at that time, I really did not realize how many of those children had dyslexia and why it was so difficult. So it was just a very kind of a gradual transformation. Did
That's
not realize
amazing.
where it would lead.
Yeah, no, and that's the magical life, as I call it. A lot of times, if we follow our passion, sounds like you were very passionate about this whole process of teaching a child how to read, and any child. And you followed that passion, and then you just allowed yourself to be led. And, fast forward to today, you've probably helped a lot more children and young adults than anybody can count or know, or even you would
Very
have an idea
rewarding.
about. Right? And so tell us, Georgie, where can people find you if they need any help with this?
Well, our website is earlyliteracysolutions.com. We have a lot of information on the website. And we also have the articles. We've done a dyslexia series for Exceptional Parent Magazine. And those articles address some of these key questions. In the back to school issue that's coming up, we're going to be discussing dyslexia screening, but these articles hit on some of the key issues in dyslexia. For example, the first article in the series was, what does dyslexia look like by grade level? And it is surprising how few people can even know what these signs are. And some of them are, well, even the dysgraphia thing, peculiar trouble with math concepts. So in that article, and that is on the website, can be downloaded. It gives you an idea. If you don't have an official screener, you can at least look at that article and say, my child, I've heard from so many parents, they go, this is my child. Because some of them are very unusual behaviors. Like, let's say a third grader who's just reading a chapter of a book, they're going to make some of the quirkiest errors. They are not the same errors that a beginning reader would read. The example I think I give in the article is, say the sentence, the cat went up the tree. They will make some syntactical errors. They will change prepositions, and they'll change the, whether it's plural or singular. They may say the cats went up into a tree. So they'll change around all of these words, and they will not even notice it. Now, sometimes that doesn't change the meaning, but sometimes it does change the meaning. And so it's these quirky behaviors that we have in that article that have alerted a lot of parents. That's how my child reads. And if it were just that, but what they also do is they miss punctuation. So they'll combine two sentences and cut off a sentence in the middle. And it completely, there's an example of that in the article too. It completely changes the meaning. And they have very weak metacognitive skills. So they do not notice when they've made a mistake or if it doesn't make sense. So when parents read this article, they are just shocked that they never understood why their child did that.
Mhm. Wow, that's amazing. Well, Georgie, this has been such a joy to have this conversation with you.
I appreciate it.
And if you watching this, listening to this, are finding it useful, please do support the channel and Georgie's work by sharing this, by liking, subscribing, so that we can bring more people like Georgie here to the channel. Georgie, we like to close our interviews with something fun that we call 3 in a Beat. And it's a little game that we play with our guests where we ask them 3 questions and you answer in either one word or one sentence at the max.
Okay, I'll try. No guarantee, but I'll try.
All right, you're ready to play. The first question, Georgie, coffee or tea?
He.
Tea. Very good. Second question. If you had a billboard where you could put just one message to live through eternity, what would that message be?
Oh, just one word?
It
Do
could
the
be a
right
word or a
thing.
sentence. It could be a word or a sentence. Yes.
Okay, do the right thing.
Do the right thing. I love it. I love it. And then last question. What do you believe is the number one skill that children today need to have?
I would say literacy for sure.
All right. Well, Georgie, thank you so much for
Thank you,
your
Yang.
time and generosity of sharing all of this wisdom and information about dyslexia. And you watching, please share the love, like, subscribe, share this episode. And we really appreciate you. If you stayed this long, we really appreciate your time and you being here. Georgie, it's been a pleasure. And I hope to see you again at the channel in the future.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.